dyslexia advocate, and she is doing some great work across our state in asking and pleading and bringing knowledge to spaces around dyslexia. And so we're so glad to have her this morning. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Diverse Learners Cooperative, we are a nonprofit organization that serves Tennessee schools, teachers, and leaders, connecting them with resources and professional learning and networks that they need to better serve diverse learners across our state. So we're so glad to have Anna with us. And with that, Anna, you can take it away.
Great. First of all, this is going to be a quick overview, just with 15 minutes. It's challenging, but I want you to know that I'm always here to answer questions. You can reach out to Diverse Learners Co-op to get my information, because what I do across Tennessee is to talk to parents and educators and policymakers. So today we're just going to touch on some tips with dyslexia, about things we learned in virtual school, about ways for you to practically support students with dyslexia in your classroom. So my story, we don't have time for much of it, but I wasn't diagnosed until I was 29 years old, and I was failing in my legal career. And I started advocating when my daughter was in second grade in 2014, when the district told us that they would not even use the word dyslexia, even though we do know that dyslexia is written into our federal law. It mentions the word dyslexia. So I joined a group of women to get the 2016 dyslexia law passed. And ever since then, I was appointed by the governor to sit on the Dyslexia Advisory Council at the Department of Education. So now I talk to families, parents, and teachers across the country, in our state and in my district, which is in Nashville. So again, we're not going to go over too much about dyslexia, because that is its presentation in its own right, but just really as teachers, understanding how many kids may be in our classroom with dyslexia is important before we start this conversation. You can see here some of those statistics so we think it's about 10 to 20% of our kids. So that's a lot of kids in your classroom that may actually have dyslexia. And I have dyslexia, so if you find typos, I always get nervous talking to teachers. Don't get out your red pen. Give me some grace, because public writing is not my favorite. So again, just as we start this conversation, dyslexia is about manipulating language. We really have trouble with getting words off the page, decoding, also with encoding and spelling. And also there's a lot of other things. If you have second graders, telling time is difficult. Third graders, times tables are going to be really, really challenging. So this is just kind of a general thing that you can look at. And a lot of people can find students, spouses, and other loved ones hear this. And a lot of people will diagnose themselves and others with dyslexia after seeing this, okay. So difficulty with reading. So we're going to go through what we have a difficulty, and then we're going to pair it with a practical teacher tip that you can use. So we know that kids with dyslexia are really slow and inaccurate readers, because we really have trouble manipulating language and seeing that directionality. And so it really makes it struggle for us to keep up in that classroom with our peers. So as teachers, you know this. What do you do about it, right? This is what our teachers always want to know. So the first thing in your classroom, when you're talking about reading, we don't want to require children with dyslexia to read or write in front of a group unless she volunteers. So, because that can be really shaming, and they may feel prepared a certain day and be able to read, but we do want to wait. There's no benefit in having a kid with dyslexia get up in front of their peers and read. The other thing we really want to do is give kids access to classroom books through our audiobooks. We can learn to be readers. We're going to learn to decode, and it's appropriate for them to be reading in those modules where they're actually learning, reading, and decoding. But if we're just talking about the classroom book that we're reading, we're doing social studies work, that's somewhere they're not going to be able to keep up with peers. So we want to give them an access to that audiobook in class for the story we're reading. And also we need to know that ear reading is not cheating, unless because again, we're worried about them getting this content. We want them to be able to keep up. And so we're really giving them access for these students with disabilities. A lot of us teachers give worksheets and textbooks, and that can be pretty complicated for kids to keep up with. So a lot of our, in MMPS, we have these computers they use, and there's already things like Natural Reader built in that will just read that. They can click it and it can read it out loud to them. Maybe just they can get some headphones, and then they can really use that with any of those kind of consumables that you're giving them. And then again, they're able to keep up with those peers. The other thing we see a lot in virtual school that we learned is that we use Florida Virtual School and other stuff we're sharing maybe through Schoology or another platform. All PDFs are not created equal. So if you're providing a PDF to a student who uses a screen reader, it may not be accessible. And so if you're doing this, you really want to make sure just to take that extra step and to double check. So what we're giving to kids is accessible for all kids, because some teachers will just be like, well, you can just put it into a Word document. I was like, okay, that's so much extra steps. I mean, that's a really tricky thing for me to do as an adult, to try to figure that out. So do take that extra time. And also realize if some of your students in virtual school, or if you're using online programming, are struggling and missing a whole lot of answers, it could be that some, I don't know if you use Florida Virtual School, some stuff is pretty deeply embedded in a cute map or a chart or a graph that, again, we can't access through screen readers. And so we're just then having to kind of eye read that piece, and we may just miss it all together because some of them just look like pictures. So you really want to say, and I know they always hide the questions in there too. So you really want to be mindful about how your students are able to access this. And even just little reminders as teachers being like, remember there's some content in the map, and maybe even go over that map before they're taking any kind of quiz or something like that, just to make sure these kids have access, because we want them to keep up with their peers. So difficulty 2 is lots of writing. So whether we're using that technology in the classroom or in virtual school, or even if we're handwriting, really writing is very tricky for us. Here's a picture I wrote, or I made, of a bright second grader who has severe dyslexia. And if you're a teacher, what would you circle in this? All of it. You'd circle most of it, right? Because the spelling is pretty atrocious. But when you read it, it actually is pretty good. The author made the mood of fear by the words, cannons, explosions shook the ground. So if you're looking at that content, is what you really want to see. Like, this is a great answer. But if you as a teacher really get stuck on the spellings, this kid's going to get a C or D. But if you look at the content, they're going to get an A. So really be careful when you're looking at this to look through that spelling as much as you can. And also capitalization and punctuation. I don't know what it is about that, but we really struggle. And also, you really have to be careful, especially in online settings. Some of our programs are only going to accept answers that are perfectly spelled. And so if you type in the word, what's the answer? The answer is Columbus, and I spell it incorrectly. I know who this person is. I know the right answer, but I'm not going to get counted off for that. So if you do have that online thing, and you have students with dyslexia who are really struggling, look into that, look into what's happening, because you can very easily get that kid on Zoom, call that kid after class, and just verbally go through like, hey, who did this? And they can be like, Columbus. And you'd be like, great, and give them credit for that. So don't let us get stuck. Also, if you're doing research projects and just sending kids to look online for stuff, a lot of times when we're looking online, when we're typing stuff in the search bar, we don't get anywhere close. And so we may be slower and get some super weird stuff, because be careful online, because we're just not able to spell that. And a lot of websites, especially library websites, things we may be going for research, may not let us spell incorrectly and use that resource. So double check that and provide some support there. So the tips we really want to do related to writing is we need word prediction. And also don't cut off for spelling. So kids with dyslexia, there's a lot of great programs. There's one I love called Co-Writer. And what we need is strong word prediction, which means when I pull up a word, I'll explain that in a second. I have a good example. It's going to read it back and spell check. So Co-Writer, if you're writing the sentence, my grandmother made me some soup, and you're typing the sentence on Co-Writer, if you write my grandmother and then you get to soup, you're going to write SO, and at the bottom it'll pull up those words, and it'll have soup and soap. And then you're not sure which it is, because those look pretty visually similar for us with dyslexia. You click it, it reads it out loud to you, soap. You can say, okay, that's not the one I mean. You click on soap, it reads soap. You double click it, it puts it in. So now you have the sentence, and then you push period. And actually this program will then read it aloud to you, and it'll say, my grandmother, me some soup. And you'll be like, ooh, I missed a word. So you can really have that feedback and hearing, and the program is pretty easy, and there's programs like it. But we do need it. It's the most helpful for us if we can read it back, because that can improve us as readers. And it can also help us with our punctuation, because we know that they're not going to read to us until we put the period on the end. So that is a great thing to do. Don't just rely on spell check. People tell us this all the time. Like, we'll just spell check it. And you're like, yeah, we're not even getting close enough. You saw in that other example that even spell checking, and even this example here, it would be so much work to spell check this, and then you're going to get answers back and you don't necessarily know what the answers say. And here we even have some homophones, like you can see some homophones here that it wouldn't pick up. I wanted to create a tale that not many people have created. Sure, I mean, not all of that. So you really have to be careful to understand spelling with dyslexia and how complicated that can be. And again, look deeply at what the kids are writing and not just that spelling. And if you have this online program you're using and spelling is an issue, teachers really get stuck. Well, I can't go outside the program. Well, be a thinker, be a risk taker. Have them, write it down, or have they can email you the answers if it's not accepting them. You can Zoom call with them. You can pull them up after class and just have them go through it. I mean, it's maybe not the easiest thing, but these kids have, they need you to look more deeply at them and give them answers for those questions. And handwriting can be pretty tricky for us too. And you also saw that handwritten answer can be really tricky with spelling. So if you can't read it, I want you to give you permission that it's okay to ask us, because teachers get really worried for kids with disabilities being like, well, I don't want to shame them. And that's great, like very important. But it's easy to be discreet, pop over and be like, hey, bud, you wrote a really good story here. I liked that part you wrote about the dinosaurs, but can you read this part to me? I'm having trouble reading it. Even if it's typed, sometimes you can see like this. Sometimes we may not be able to read it. It's also okay to say something like, spell check is the worst sometimes, don't you think? So I just couldn't read this word. So feel free to have that like safe and open dialogue with these kids, because we know we're not great spellers. And as long as you give us space to kind of own that, it's okay, as long as you do it in a non-shaming way. So this one is not a one that teachers are super excited about. We do need a lot of our tests read aloud. And some of this, my alarm telling me to take my medicine. Sorry about that. So students with dyslexia need these tests read out loud. And this may depend on their 504 plan, their IEP, but understanding why is a big piece. So, and it's an issue too in virtual school. How do you manage that? I have a tip for it. But even understanding that even math tests need to be read out loud. Teachers don't always understand that, because this kind of stuff, I mean, specificity matters. So if we read this one and we read, which of the following is a polygon? A is a polygon. And then, but that's not what it says, because I read is wrong or isn't wrong, so that matters. And, the wrong answer is always in there. And so if you see kids in math really struggling and you're not reading it out loud, you need to look at this, because, specificity, that's not the right word. It really matters for those kids. So reading test out loud is super important. So what do you do as a teacher when you need kids' tests read out loud? This is hard, right? So going to the virtual setting, it was pretty tricky. So don't try to tell your kids to use text to speech in testing, because the robot reads the answers really weird. The letters are hard to follow, and it's just not really a natural way for a test to be read to you. It can be really hard. And also if they're doing any kind of math or there's any symbols in there, it gets really confusing. So in the virtual setting, it was imperfect, but always allowing a caregiver is okay. An older sibling can read out loud. Having a support staff person pop into Zoom and read that test out loud, even if it's just the woman from the front office, that can work too. But giving those kids that access, and usually as caregivers, I mean, we're not necessarily, maybe older siblings would cheat, but I mean, I think again, you just want to make sure that be like, just have them read it out loud to you. And that's just the best solution. I mean, virtual school has been really hard, but it's okay to do some workarounds like that. I mean, they're not taking the SAT, right? So we're just going to try to do the best we can. In person, I know this is hard. Plan ahead to have another adult in the room. Don't have other kids read it to them, because that's really shaming, because then if you have a peer reading to you, you just feel pretty embarrassed. It can be a SPED teacher, it can be a student teacher, or even a parent volunteer if you have a group of kids who are coming in with dyslexia for some tests. You can have that person there if you're in some of the elementary schools that do have more parent volunteers in. Don't tell them to give it a try. So when we're thinking about dyslexia, it's an invisible disability. It's a little bit harder for us to understand, but sometimes as a teacher, you can be like, okay, would I do the same thing with a different disability category? If this was a blind student or a student who was physically impaired, would I tell them to give it a try first? No, that would be super rude and like really inappropriate. And so I think sometimes, you do have to kind of wind it back and take a pause and realize what you're asking a student with a disability to do. So don't ask them to just give it a try. And if it doesn't work out, we'll try something later. No. So difficulty 4, we need extra time. And that we can be slower workers, like we talked about with reading. And we do want to try to keep up with our peers, but we need to turn the timers off. So what that means is on online school, some of our quizzes would actually have these big timers that would pop up on some of those quizzes we were taking. And I mean, I was helping my daughter read out loud when one came up, and we like just panicked, and then like we didn't get the answer done in time, and it just shut the quiz down. So we got to figure out how to turn those off. And if you can't, I'll give you some tips about ways to kind of work around that. And also with those multiplication tables, I think we really want them doing this all in 1 minute or 3 minutes, but realizing that they can't, that's okay. And saying, you don't have to, or you only have to answer 10 questions in this time, and do that discreetly so they don't feel kind of public shame and know they're working so much slower. But that is time is a real issue. So, like I said, multiplication tables, you can give them that extra time just in class. So if you hit the online timer, teachers are like, I don't know how to turn off the timer. It's okay just to tell them to print the page, screenshot the page, send the questions to me in an email, in a text message, however you feel okay getting that information. And then it may take a minute for you to then go back and type in those answers or whatever else you need to do to get that into the grade book. But it's okay to be creative. We just want to make sure that, because they're not going to produce if that time is ticking. They just can't do that. And again, we want to give the kids access, even if it may be another step for you. If you kind of streamline this process and communicate well, people are gonna, it goes quicker than you think it might. So the last one we're going to talk about here is managing online chat groups. We're using this a lot, and it can be a great way, especially for some of our middle school kids, to really kind of chime in real time while you're teaching. And so we may be asking our kids to post things publicly and kind of leave them up on that board on Schoology. We might be in the middle of class. We may say, take 2 minutes to answer this question, and then the teacher will kind of get that real-time feedback, which is a really great tool. For us, that could be tricky because now we're going to have this up. If we're pretty ashamed of how we're writing, that's kind of like public record. All of our friends can see it. And so we may take an unrealistic amount of time to like get it perfectly, but a lot of spell check doesn't work in there. And I do have some examples about some kids who have tried to write answers that were appropriate, but really wrote some maybe inappropriate things in there, not out of being a bad kid, but just kind of out of spelling so poorly. They wrote something that was not intended to be funny, but it was, and that's really embarrassing. So when you're giving this kind of you're giving this kind of open feedback, give them a choice. Maybe say, hey, I know that you may not be comfortable. How do you feel? Like, let them know. Don't say, well, I know you'll be ashamed of your terrible writing, so don't post it. They may be like, no, I'm totally fine with it. Everyone's on their own journey with their dyslexia and about how they feel about it, but give them that option. And if they don't want to post an answer, say, that's okay. You can text it to me, you can email it to me, or you can voice memo it to me. As long as I do get that answer before, 10 o'clock tonight, that's okay. So be willing to take answers in other formats. In the classroom, if you are having that, okay, take 2 minutes, give me this answer here, and then you're moving along, understand that kids with dyslexia, that 2 minutes isn't enough. So you may be 10 minutes down and they're still trying to write the answer for the one from a while ago, and they may be missing all that content. So at the end of the class, they really felt like they needed to give you that answer. So make sure that when you move on with the group, saying thank you for those of us that gave the answer. If you weren't able to complete it, we're moving on. Join back in with the conversation. So kind of cue them that it's okay to come back. Also, in situations like this, the teachers really always push that write everything in a complete sentence, which is fine. We want kids to write in a complete sentence, but make sure in this kind of like just casual give and take where you're just kind of doing a temperature check, let them know it doesn't have to be spelled well and you can just use keywords. So I think just even giving that grace to the whole class, you're not saying like, well, Gwendolyn, you sure are a terrible speller. So, but really saying, hey guys, just do this quick, do this casual. We don't worry. It really helps us reduce our shame, because shame plays a lot into, especially in our, older elementary and middle school kids can really feel embarrassed and get kind of caught up in that shame. So we really want to reduce that as much as we possibly can. So those are my main teacher tips, and we'll have time for questions maybe at the end. But here's just some other quick hits for things about writing, because I know teachers, we want to build these great writers, but it's just tricky, and we need some tips about how to do this. So try not to use your red pen too much on us. Really, if you do like your red pen and you're really just like connected with her, really pick that skill and let's edit on a specific skill we were learning that week. So if we are really just saying, we're working on capitalization, let's just circle that. And maybe if there's a ton of errors, just pick one. Like if this kid really is struggling, like that first answer we saw about what the author was saying, that we just maybe work on circling with the red pen, capitalization at the beginning of the first sentence, and then kind of work on there. Because if you circle everything, I mean, you know how you would feel if you got that back, and that doesn't give them any information to improve their writing. So maybe just pick, if there's so many, just pick one thing that you really want to work on. If you're writing you want them to write some new story, we may be great writers. We may be able to want to write like the dinosaur stormed through the village, but we don't know how to write that. So you can be like, he went fast, you know? So we may really be limiting our own language based on what we can spell. So if you give them, here I did a Halloween one, if you just give them a little story vocab, they might not still spell those perfectly because copying can be hard for us, but we're going to get a whole lot closer, and it's going to build confidence if you do have some of those new words. If you have a kid with dyslexia who surprises you and you write a story about dinosaurs and they spell everything correctly, and then the next week you write about a different topic and the writing is terrible, do understand that if we have a subject that we love, we can get those words pretty right a lot of the time. So that can confuse you. Well, you wrote this great story last week and this is, this week it's really bad. Kind of understanding dyslexia is kind of where that can help you have some compassion around that. Normalize the editing process. So don't say this always has to be perfect the first time. Say it is a process, kids, and it's not going to be right, but we can keep working because that's how real authors do it. And giving them a chance to self-edit, because when I write, I have spelling issues, I struggle with a whole lot of it. So having just a little checklist that they can go back with, either maybe if they don't have time to keep up, but maybe they can come back the next day and do it. Just say, did you check these things? And give them those reminders, like after a period, there should be a capitalization, because that's going to help us because we cannot produce that all at once usually. Oh, definitely give feedback on content of written work, right? Because it could be a really good story that is technically poor, but what we really want these kids is to try to use good vocabulary, complex sentence structure, using those conversational points in there. So if they're really attempting to do a great job of that, brag on that, because that is what we really want to brag on. And the other stuff, can be edited, and, you can support them with that. But it's that love of writing and that creative writing we really want to try to foster. The other thing is challenge us. Like, we are usually really smart kids. And if you provide a space for us to be able to show what we know in a safe way, where we can really risk take and write these more creative stories in an imperfect way, I think you'll be impressed with what you're going to get and kind of following through on some of that editing. And the last part is teacher don'ts. So don't be afraid to mention dyslexia. My daughter wrote over here in it, she said, don't be afraid to mention dyslexia to people with it. Like, we know we have it. So don't be scared, again, in a safe way. Don't tell us to rewrite an entire work, because sometimes it's so poor, you might just be like, we just need to rewrite this. Yeah, don't. If you really want us to focus on something, maybe have us try rewriting a sentence, or, if they're doing it online, it's a little bit easier, but handwriting, that's pretty exhausting. If they don't have access, if their iPad's down, I know some of us were having technical difficulties this morning, that if it's not working, they don't have access, don't tell them to just we'll give it a try without it. Again, we need to kind of center ourselves and understand that that's not necessarily always appropriate. And the last thing is, don't be surprised if students use dyslexia as an excuse. I do this, you'd be like, because teachers usually will back off pretty fast. So if you have a kid who is using their dyslexia as an excuse, that means it's time to dig in and see where their shame is showing up and see what is really happening, and see if you can get to the bottom of that. Because we do that, but you need to have compassion around that for these students. Oh, and there you go. That's it. That's all I got.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. That was so full of practical tips and examples of how this plays out into the classroom and with our students. And so at this point, I wanted to let you know, for our coffee chat regulars and those that are new, that we are doing a 2-part series coming up next week and the week following on closing out for the year as a case manager, and strategies to make sure that your students are ready for the end of the year and that they're going to be set up for next year as well. So that's for the next 2 weeks, and I'll include that in my follow-up email too. But we have a few minutes if you have any questions for Anna, or thoughts that you want to add.
Should have silenced that. And that's okay. I know it's a lot to take in. And people are just kind of starting to learn more about dyslexia. So you're always welcome to email me later if you think of a question. I'm happy to answer those, or anything else you guys need.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, for being here. Thanks to everybody else for being here. I hope you have a wonderful Friday, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.